The authorities discovered a deceased woman in her residence, prompting an investigation that quickly revealed troubling clues. As the inquiry progressed, increasingly bizarre and chilling information came to light. Eventually, after years of scrutiny, the truth was unveiled, surprising everyone with its unexpected twist of events. Karen Gregory was born in Albany, New York, on March 29, 1948. She was the oldest of 4 siblings and took care of her brothers and sisters from a young age. Karen had a passion for sports and spent a lot of time outdoors. She also had a love for art and aspired to work in that field. Upon completing high school, Karen pursued her education at Nazareth College in Rochester, where she earned both a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science degree. Following her studies, she worked as an art teacher at an elementary school for a few years before transitioning into a career as a graphic designer. In 1983, at the age of 35, Karen relocated to Florida, where she met David Mackey. David was a manager at an organization that offered consulting services to Vietnam veterans, and the two quickly developed a strong connection. After dating for over a year, David invited Karen to move in with him in Gulfport. Prior to this, Karen resided in an apartment with a friend and frequently commuted to David's residence. She accepted his proposal and began the process of moving her belongings to his place. On May 22nd, Karen gathered the remaining items from her apartment and officially moved out. She expressed some nervousness to her neighbor, as David was away for work, and she would be alone in his house for a week. After visiting her friend's house, Karen shared her excitement about living with David. Later that night, she returned to David's house. The following day, David tried reaching out to Karen multiple times, but received no response. Concerned, he contacted her neighbor, who informed him that she hadn't seen Karen since the previous day. Following that, David reached out to numerous acquaintances of Karen and her sibling, yet none of them had any information regarding her whereabouts. He persistently attempted to contact her throughout the day, but to no avail. The subsequent day, on May 24th, David made an early morning call to their residence once more, hoping to intercept Karen before she departed for work. However, he was met with silence once again. Subsequently, he contacted her employer and discovered that she had not reported for duty. At this juncture, David's apprehension peaked, and he harbored concerns that an unfortunate incident may have befallen Karen. He proceeded to contact local medical facilities and law enforcement agencies to ascertain if anyone fitting Karen's description had been encountered. Upon learning that they had not, he opted to reach out to his neighbor, Amy. David inquired if Karen's vehicle was stationed in front of the residence. Amy glanced out the window and confirmed its presence. This only exacerbated David's anxiety. He implored Amy to visit the residence and knock on the door. Consumed by worry, he remained on the line with her until she embarked on fulfilling his request. Amy approached the side entrance and knocked, yet received no response. She circumnavigated the premises and noticed an ajar window. Calling out Karen's name repeatedly yielded no reply. Extending her arm through the window, she drew back the curtain and was confronted with a distressing sight. The window overlooked the bedroom, revealing a bloodied female figure sprawled on the floor in the hallway. Although the face was obscured by a wall, Amy surmised it was likely Karen. Overcoming her shock, Amy hastened back to her abode, where David was still on the line. She seized the phone and relayed the distressing news before promptly contacting emergency services. Medical professionals promptly arrived at the location, yet could only confirm Karen's demise. Detectives commenced scrutinizing the crime scene, which left even seasoned law enforcement officers aghast. The copious amount of blood scattered throughout the residence indicated that Karen had valiantly resisted her assailant until the bitter end. Blood traces guided the way from the corridor to the entrance, where shards of glass lay shattered. Investigators observed a few strands of hair, matching Karen's color, entangled in the broken glass. The deduction was that she had almost reached the outside, but was intercepted by her assailant. Inside the bathroom, the first clue was discovered, a bloody footprint imprinted on the floor. Karen's feet were inspected, revealing no bloodstains, indicating that the footprint belonged to her murderer. The mystery remained as to why the killer was wandering barefoot in the bathroom. Forensic specialists examined the victim's body, determining that she had suffered approximately 20 stab wounds and endured a brutal attack. Biological evidence was extracted from the perpetrator, but unfortunately, DNA analysis was not available in 1984, rendering this lead useless. Additionally, bloody fingerprints were found on her body, yet they were too smudged to be of any use. The experts estimated that the woman had been killed around 30 hours before her body was discovered, suggesting that the attack occurred on the same night she returned home from her friend's house. Another peculiar detail that caught the attention of the authorities and medical examiners was the way Karen's body was dressed. She was found wearing a shirt with a lace corset on top, a clear indication of the perpetrator's actions. Once the police completed their investigation and gathered all possible evidence, Karen's friends were allowed to clean up the crime scene. They wanted to spare David, who adored her, from witnessing the gruesome aftermath upon his return. David, who was attending a conference on the opposite side of the country, would need ample time to make his way back home. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing the neighbors in this prestigious and secure neighborhood where the crime rate was exceptionally low and residents were closely knit, even having a neighborhood watch. This serves as a pact among neighbors to uphold order and promptly alert the authorities of any suspicious activities. Regrettably, the neighborhood watch failed to fulfill its duties in this particular instance. Investigators discovered that on the night of May 23rd, at approximately 1:15 a.m., 16 residents heard a chilling scream, yet none of them contacted law enforcement. Each individual claimed the scream ceased abruptly, and they did not perceive any imminent danger. Even the leader of the neighborhood watch, residing directly across from the victim, did not deem it necessary to notify the police. Engrossed in repairing his motorcycle in the garage and engrossed in the radio, he barely registered a faint scream. Exiting the garage, he strolled down the street, observed nothing amiss, and returned home. A neighbor residing opposite David disclosed a peculiar observation. The following morning, she noticed his front door ajar and heard a scream the previous night, though she did not connect the two events. She recounted a crucial detail. Upon police arrival, the door was securely locked. Given that the body had been inside for approximately 30 hours, the perpetrator might have revisited the scene to erase evidence, such as shutting the door. Intriguingly, there were no signs of forced entry on any doors. Detectives theorized the culprit may have entered through the rear window, yet no signs of forced entry were evident there either. Karen either left the window open all night or willingly allowed the killer inside. The neighborhood watch leader disclosed another intriguing detail to investigators. The day following Karen's demise, an unfamiliar man arrived at her residence. Exiting his vehicle, he knocked on the door, surveyed the surroundings, returned to his car, then reappeared with a piece of paper. Placing it on Karen's car windshield, he departed shortly after. The authorities swiftly inspected the vehicle and indeed discovered a message on the windshield that read, "Karen and David, hi. I stopped by around 7:15 p.m. but didn't see any signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back, but I have what you asked for." The detectives immediately took note of the phrase, "no signs of life." Given that Karen had been deceased for nearly an entire day by the time this individual arrived, such a choice of words was incredibly concerning. The note was signed by Peter, prompting the investigators to track him down. Surprisingly, he had been in close proximity to them the entire time. Shortly after the discovery of the body, Peter was informed about it by Karen's former neighbor and promptly visited their residence. He cooperated fully, answering all inquiries. Willingly, he provided his fingerprints and footprints and also disclosed his whereabouts near the victim's home. According to Peter, a few days prior, Karen had phoned him, inviting him and David for dinner. However, there was a peculiar detail. Karen allegedly informed him that David would be present, despite the fact that he was scheduled to depart on a week-long business trip. The investigators also inquired about the meaning behind the phrase, "I have what you requested," in the note. Peter explained that he had borrowed a cassette from them and intended to return it. Another odd detail was that Peter purportedly failed to notice the shattered glass strewn across the pathway to the front entrance, not to mention the multiple broken windows. He maintained that he had not seen anything or paid any attention to it. During their conversation, one of the detectives observed a significant gash on Peter's hand. When the officer examined his hand, Peter concealed the wound, attributing it to scratches from playing with dogs or working on his car. All of these circumstances appeared highly suspicious, prompting the detectives to verify his alibi. Peter claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home, a statement corroborated by his neighbor. The authorities did not hastily dismiss him from the list of suspects, as his alibi seemed dubious. However, a new suspect emerged swiftly: David, Karen's partner. He claimed to have been in Rhode Island that fateful night, a staggering 2,000 kilometers away from his residence, sound asleep in his hotel room. Yet a peculiar discovery awaited the investigators at the crime scene. A local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23rd, the very day of Karen's demise. The situation grew more perplexing, prompting the detectives to ponder whether David could have flown to Florida, committed the heinous act, and returned in time for his next public appearance. After meticulous calculations of flight and travel durations, they concluded that such a scenario was indeed plausible. Moreover, no one could corroborate David's alibi for that night, as he purportedly slumbered alone in his lodging. The head of the neighborhood watch also divulged his observations, recounting instances of discord between Karen and David during her visits to his residence. Conversely, David maintained that their relationship was harmonious, with rare disagreements. When questioned about the newspaper, he asserted that he had purchased it on May 21st from a nearby store, intending to peruse the weather forecast for his upcoming journey. Subsequent inquiries at the store confirmed David's account, with the clerk recalling the transaction on the specified date. The clerk clarified that the publication had indeed been issued several days prior, a common occurrence in the realm of print media. Consequently, suspicions surrounding David waned. Upon inquiring about missing items from Karen's abode, David noted the absence of a white lace corset she had acquired months earlier, strikingly similar to the one worn by her assailant. This revelation immediately steered the investigators towards the notion that the perpetrator had seized it as a macabre memento. The authorities decided to explore a different lead discovered in the victim's residence, a high-quality drawing of a watch signed with the name Stephen. A specific detail caught the attention of the investigators. The paper seemed to be stained with blood. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Stephen was a colleague of Karen at the same workplace, prompting the detectives to question her co-workers. Valuable information came to light, as almost all the employees described Stephen as an odd individual. He persistently made advances towards his female colleagues, shared inappropriate images with them, and even wrote a lewd poem in an attempt to get them to read it. The women who worked alongside him admitted to feeling intimidated by Stephen. Karen had also raised concerns about his behavior multiple times, but unfortunately, the management did not take any action. During the interrogation, Stephen denied giving Karen the drawing and insisted that he barely knew the victim. He even offered to undergo a polygraph test to prove his innocence. The investigators arranged for the test, which took an unexpected turn. Initially, everything seemed normal, but after a particular question, Stephen confessed to killing Karen. However, moments later, he retracted his statement, claiming he had no involvement in the crime. What baffled the detectives was that the polygraph results did not indicate deception in either instance. This left the investigators puzzled, unable to solely rely on the polygraph outcomes. This device falls short of perfection and is simply incapable of accurately discerning whether an individual is being truthful or not. Simultaneously, it was evident to them that Stephen was undeniably an eccentric individual capable of saying anything. Subsequently, experts scrutinized his sketch and determined that the crimson mark was indeed from ketchup, not blood. Consequently, Doubts arose regarding Stephen's involvement in Karen's tragic demise. Despite a plethora of suspects, law enforcement failed to amass sufficient evidence against anyone, leaving the case unresolved for numerous months. Detectives persisted in their investigation, yet no new leads surfaced. This persisted until December, when a noteworthy incident occurred. A distinguished resident of Gulfport was retiring, prompting local residents to organize celebratory events. Numerous individuals attended, including a woman named Mary, who engaged in a conversation with a police officer present. During their discussion, the topic of Karen Gregory's murder arose, and Mary inadvertently disclosed that she too had heard her piercing scream that fateful night. The officer immediately noted a peculiar detail. Mary resided 2 blocks away from Karen's residence, a location initially overlooked by the authorities. The fact that she heard the scream suggested it was exceptionally loud. Conversely, the head of the neighborhood watch, residing directly across from Karen's house, described it as faint. However, if neighbors 2 blocks away could hear it, the man could not possibly deem it quiet, especially since he was in his garage with the door ajar at the time. These discrepancies raised suspicions, although the police hesitated to implicate the head of the neighborhood watch. He was none other than 22-year-old George Lewis, a firefighter and close friend to nearly all the local police officers. George resided with his wife and young child, and neighbors unanimously regarded him as trustworthy and honorable. Detectives were unable to overlook Mary's account. They reached out to George, requesting his presence at the station at his convenience. George agreed, but failed to show up. It is important to mention that prior to this incident, he frequently visited the station to socialize with his acquaintances. The lead detective in this case even attended his wedding, making it challenging to view George as a suspect. It was only a month later, in January 1985, that they were able to interview him. George maintained that the scream did not appear very loud to him, attributing it to the music playing on the radio. When asked if he recalled anything else from that night, George reiterated his initial statement with one exception. Initially, he mentioned hearing the scream, stepping out of the garage, and walking down the street. However, this time he stated that he simply walked up to the road, glanced around, and returned. Despite the discrepancy in his testimonies, given the passage of several months, it did not raise significant concerns. Nevertheless, the police decided to verify his claims by proposing a polygraph test, which George agreed to. Surprisingly, he did not pass the test. During a subsequent conversation with the detectives, George confessed to withholding a crucial detail. He asserted that on the night Karen vanished, he spotted an unfamiliar man near her residence. George could only recall that the man was tall with red hair and a beard. This revelation prompted detectives to question the veracity of his statements once more. George could not provide a satisfactory explanation for omitting this information during the initial interview, except for fear that the man might harm his family since he knew where they lived. Despite their efforts to pursue this lead and locate the man, the outcome was fruitless. Another aspect to consider was the considerable distance of nearly 30 meters between George's and Karen's homes, compounded by the darkness of the night. The detectives harbored doubts regarding the man's ability to discern the color of another person's hair under such circumstances, yet George remained steadfast in his account. The authorities meticulously reconstructed the events of that fateful night and prompted George to provide a description of the individual who stood 30 meters away from him. Unfortunately, he was unable to discern any distinguishing features, further fueling the detectives' skepticism. Despite this setback, they diligently canvassed the vicinity, inquiring with local residents about any sightings of a suspicious individual with red hair roaming the streets at night. To their astonishment, several women confessed to sporadically glimpsing a man peering into their windows under the cover of darkness. While none could definitively identify the man's visage, one observant woman claimed that he bore a striking resemblance to George Lewis. Her certainty wavered due to the dim lighting, and the man swiftly absconded. George conceded to occasionally surveilling his neighbors' homes, asserting that it was solely for their protection. He professed to ensuring their well-being as the head of the neighborhood watch. However, these revelations only served to heighten suspicions against him. In March 1985, George consented to a second polygraph examination. On this occasion, he altered his narrative once more, confessing to not only spotting a man outside Karen's residence, but also engaging in conversation with him. Allegedly, the man issued a death threat should George disclose their encounter. The polygraph operator once again detected deception, prompting the investigator to directly question George about Karen Gregory's demise. His denial was met with skepticism, as his responses were deemed untruthful. Subsequently, the detective sought insight from George's wife, who recounted being roused from slumber by a blood-curdling scream that night, instilling fear within her. Frantically searching for her husband, she ventured to the garage only to find it vacant, with the lights extinguished. The woman returned to her home and settled in the kitchen, patiently awaiting her husband, who arrived half an hour later. The investigators then decided to explore George's background and conversed with his ex-wife, who confessed that despite his outward appearance of kindness, care, and responsibility, he was actually quite aggressive and resorted to physical violence during their frequent disputes. She disclosed that he even resorted to choking her at times. Subsequently, the detectives interviewed George's close friends, who shared intriguing details. Prior to the murder, when Karen was not residing in the area but visited occasionally, George confided in his friends about his fondness for her. Additionally, it came to light that George occasionally engaged in group activities and expressed a desire for Karen to participate. Further discussions with George's friends revealed that, in the summer of 1984, he engaged in a clandestine relationship with a young woman residing nearby. Upon speaking with her, she revealed that on her 17th birthday, George gifted her a white lace corset, which was too large for her, but he insisted she wear it regularly. The police requested the corset from her and promptly presented it to Karen's boyfriend, who identified it as matching one that had gone missing from their residence and fitting Karen's size. This marked a significant breakthrough in the case against George, prompting the detectives to intensify their investigation. They obtained a footprint from George and forwarded it to FBI analysts for comparison with the one discovered at the crime scene in Karen's home. Subsequently, a conclusive match was confirmed. In March 1986, George was summoned to the police station, where he repeatedly denied being at Karen's house on the night of the murder until confronted with the forensic evidence. Initially maintaining his innocence, George eventually provided the authorities with a new account of events. Upon this occasion, he recounted witnessing a red-haired man near Karen's residence, then hastened to her abode only to discover a scene of crimson horror, with the woman lying in the hallway, her throat grievously slashed. Subsequently, he succumbed to panic and fled the premises, vowing to erase the memory of that ghastly sight from his mind forever. Naturally, the detectives dismissed his tale as pure fantasy, deeming it utterly implausible. However, George's assertion about the victim's throat wound was proven correct, a detail that had not been disclosed to the public. Even if his narrative held truth, the profusion of blood on Karen's body would have obscured the wound from view, a fact that even seasoned medical professionals acknowledged. This led to the conclusion that George could only have known about the cut if he was the perpetrator. These revelations were sufficient to warrant the man's arrest, which took place on March 15th, nearly 2 years after the tragic incident. In the state of Florida, he faced the grim prospect of the death penalty for his alleged crime. Despite the police's certainty, George's loyal friends and colleagues from the fire department remained steadfast in their belief in his innocence, rallying to support him in every possible way. They generously contributed a portion of their earnings to assist George's wife and child, and even managed to raise $300,000 for his bail. Some of his comrades went so far as to mortgage their own homes. Ultimately, George was released in late December and resided in his home for another half-year until the commencement of his trial on June 4, 1987. Throughout the legal proceedings, George's legal team maintained his innocence, asserting that he was not responsible for the heinous act, a stance that he unwaveringly maintained in his interactions with law enforcement. Nevertheless, when the suspect was given the opportunity to speak, he presented an entirely different narrative. The beginning was consistent. He spotted a man near Karen's home, rushed inside, and discovered her lifeless body. This sight caused George to become extremely ill, prompting him to rush to the bathroom where he vomited. Supposedly, this was his attempt to explain the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. However, there was a glaring inconsistency. If he had entered Karen's home barefoot, the bloody traces would have led from where he found her body to the bathroom, but they were not present. When questioned about why he didn't contact the authorities, George claimed that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too frightened to confide in anyone. It is worth noting that he had been a firefighter since the age of 18 and regularly encountered distressing situations at work, yet when faced with his deceased neighbor, he suddenly couldn't bring himself to call the police. The prosecution argued that George had romantic feelings for Karen. They alleged that he waited for several months until her boyfriend was away for a week and then took advantage of the situation. George broke into her home and assaulted her. Despite the woman's attempts to scream and resist, he ultimately killed her and subjected her to violence. As for the footprint of his foot in the bathroom, there could be a simple explanation. According to his wife, George returned home only half an hour after the scream. It seems that he attempted to launder his clothes, stained with Karen's blood, in the bathroom and removed his shoes along with his socks, which also bore bloodstains. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, and in the end, the jury found him guilty. A month later, when his sentencing was set to be announced, the judge unexpectedly scheduled a retrial. George's legal team advocated for this, and they were successful. They argued that some evidence had been tampered with by the police, and that the prosecution had failed to fully establish their client's guilt. The judge's ruling came as a surprise to all involved, as such occurrences are rare. Nonetheless, the prosecutor managed to contest this ruling, resulting in its reversal in 1989. Consequently, George received a life sentence instead. Due to his lack of criminal record prior to the murder, the death penalty was not considered. Despite numerous attempts to appeal his sentence, George's efforts were consistently rejected. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, many of his friends and family members remained steadfast in their belief of his innocence. George passed away in prison in 2014 at the age of 52, maintaining his innocence until the very end. He even granted an interview expressing the hardships of bearing the consequences for a crime he did not commit. A crucial aspect of this narrative is that 16 neighbors heard Karen's cries for help, yet none of them took the initiative to contact the authorities. Given the proximity of the police station to their street, law enforcement could have responded promptly. Detectives involved in the investigation acknowledged that Karen's life might have been spared if action had been taken.